Here's a peek at what guests had to say after the show.
Okay, this is for you, Glenn. What is the legitimate level of secrecy to which our government is entitled?
Well, we're supposed to have a government, which is why we call them public officials, which is transparent in almost all cases, except in extremely compelling cases of national security. And we are called private individuals because they're supposed to know nothing about us except in very rare circumstances. We've completely reversed that, so we know almost nothing about what the government is doing.
Right.
And they know everything about us. They can read our emails, listen to our telephone conversations, monitor and store what we do. And this has been a really radical reversal that I think we need to reverse back to the way it was.
Remember, you're right. Remember in Michael Moore's Sicko, he goes to France, remember at the end, and he says, you know, the difference between that country and here is, here, we're afraid of the government. There it's the reverse. Government's afraid of the people. And that's the way it should be.
Yeah.
Government should be afraid of the people.
Exactly.
But, no, we do, and, you know, I mean, I meant after the Boston thing and we saw the cops and the tanks and everything, I've made quite a thing about we kind of live in a police state, and it upset a lot of people, but we kind of do live in a police
But
state.
even there, listening to our calls, reading our emails, it didn't detect that plot.
No.
They tend to sort of create their own plots a lot of times by trying to lure people into plots who weren't otherwise doing them, but the real plots they seem not to catch. So it's not only invasive, but kind of ineffective.
I mean, I'm not blaming the police in
I'm just saying,
Cleveland for what happened there, but I do notice that they have no trouble breaking in people's doors when they're like smoking pot. Like you read those stories all the time. Like they found a guy with a pipe. Oh, and they took his kids away because, you know, he had a marijuana pipe and he was smoking, you know. God, we can't have that in America, so. Okay, what will it take for the government and the military to finally, well, we asked that question. Don't you watch the show? Why are national polls irrelevant to the gun control debate? I guess that's for you. Well, national polls, meaning that 90% of the people wanted background checks and we didn't get it done.
Well, that number's not necessarily true, but let's suppose it were, for the sake of argument.
What's not true?
The 90% figure is widely disputed.
Really?
Yeah.
I
and
have not
there
heard
are
that so
a bunch of polls afterwards that showed that it's partly because there's a difference between how much people care. And so if you ask them, are they in favor of background checks, and then you tell them what that background check would mean, you get different answers. But let's presume it were true just for the sake of argument. They're not,
but it's a majority. It's over 50%.
Right. They're certainly not irrelevant to the national debate. They're by no means irrelevant. But they do have to be set within the American context, which is that you're dealing with a right which is enumerated in the Constitution. So, for example, 90% of people wanted flag burning, but, you know, they can't get that. If you asked a majority, you'd have a national religion here, probably, a state religion.
No. We just did that. It was 33%, 34%.
Oh, did you? Okay, well, that's good
34% want a national religion, yes.
Okay. Well,
but there's always that 1/3. You cannot march them into the 19th century no matter how hard you try.
But, right, and that's good news that it's so low.
It's good news?
It's good news that it's so low. It's not a majority. But my point is, if you'd found 90% in that poll, it wouldn't have been irrelevant, but it would have been irrelevant to what the American government did about it, because you have the Senate. And I know I watched you a couple of weeks ago, and, you know, I know your feelings on the Senate, but the Senate exists very deliberately to be the state's representation. So once you filter these numbers through the Senate, through the Constitution, it fills a role in determining what the president might make a priority and what the House should make a priority, but that's not how American government works. It's not supposed to work like that.
Well, you know, you say that because that's what we have now, but that was not always the case. The Senate was a compromise. Madison, who pretty much wrote the Constitution, he didn't want a Senate. He didn't think that was a good idea, that states with no people had the same amount of representation as states with a lot of people. I mean, California has 36 million people. We get the same representation as Wyoming, which has 4.
Right, but California...
That was a compromise.
No, I understand it was a compromise. I think it was a good one. I mean, I'm happy to respect that you don't like it, but it is nonetheless the law of the land, and I think it works very well because Wyoming and California are very different states. And if California wishes to change its gun laws, if New York wishes to change its gun laws, that's great. But they wouldn't necessarily work in Utah or Idaho or Wyoming. Why do it nationally? Why not do it locally?
What do you mean they wouldn't work?
Well, it doesn't make sense in Utah, for example, where there's almost no gun murders at all, to impose the same sort of laws that you would need in a city like New York.
Well, so you're saying all the gun laws should be by state? This kind of reminds me during the health care debate when people like, who's Nikki Haley was the one in South Carolina says, well, what's right for South Carolina's health laws might not be right for New York. Really? People don't get gallbladder cancer in South Carolina? What sort of nonsense is that? People have the same bodies, the same health issues, every state. That's ridiculous.
Well...
Okay. All right. We'll move on. Mark Bittman, what with global warming colliding with food production around the world, I'm not sure what that means. Okay, why are you against genetically modified foods, i.e. developing crops that are drought tolerant? Okay, that would help out farmers and their livestock.
That's good 4 questions at once. But
yeah. Right.
the way to deal with global warming is to reduce industrial meat production because it's responsible for something between 20 and 50% of greenhouse generating gases. So GMOs are not the answer here by any means.
No, and you know, again, Monsanto, evil. Evil.
It's been that way for a long time, actually.
I know.
I think we're talking 40 or 50 years of evilness with Monsanto.
And Obama, a big disappointment on confronting Monsanto.
Well, yes, but yeah. I mean, what
I know
the
he's got a lot on his
say
plate.
about food and GMOs and labeling and all of that stuff, what they say and what's happened, there's been a huge differential, and between what they say and what needs to happen is even a bigger differential. But this goes for many things.
Okay. Zachary, is prosecution the best way to address social media bullying?
That's you, isn't it?
No, probably not. I mean, prosecution for people who've committed crimes makes sense to me, and bullying is a whole separate issue, and technology is a whole separate issue on top of that, and social media and interconnectivity and this world that we live in, which is supposedly so much more immediate, and we all have so much more access to each other, and we're so much more intertwined, but the reality is we've never been more fractured, and you know, the way to stop bullying in any form is to connect with your children and teach them how to be responsible, respectful contributors to society and hold them accountable to that, you know?
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you, audience. We will see you next week.
Real Time with Bill Maher, Friday night at 10. Ask Bill and his guests your questions right after the show at HBO.com.